Okay, hello. So this is the third video, and today we're going to be talking about a couple of things. We're going to be talking about logic. We're going to be talking about direct influence, a distant influence, sorry. And we're going to also talk about what I would call the thought experiment called the lonely child. And we're also going to be talking about resolution as well, or the concept of resolution. And let's start with the concept of resolution. Okay. Okay. So let's zoom in here so that way we can kind of zoom out so we can kind of get this feeling over here. Okay. So let's imagine you. Right. Okay. Now we're just going to separate ourselves from the organizational environment. Okay, so we're going to withdraw ourselves. We're going to just focus on just one person. So, obviously, your brain has neuroconnections in it. All right. And that has a distinct view of who you are. So, let's give an example of some neurons here. So, we have a group of neurons that are influencing each other, that also follow it's a horrible neuron. That also have distinctive influence going on. And this element keeps going on forever. Well, almost forever. It goes on as long as you have neuroconnections. And so when we add up the sum of let's just say brain activity. We're finding that that links to your current sum. But we can't really say that there is only connections between two neurons. And because we essentially have a network of neurons in our brain, they're all working together to create certain elements, right? They all link together, shooting a result. You know, the firing of one, it's a two, it's a three, it's a four, it's a five. But the firing of one can lead to another string of, let's just step four, step five. but this has the same concept. And so what we're finding is that, so resolution is the concept of pretty much how much can you fit on a screen. Let's think of it like a screen, your screen right here. Like most screens are 1080p or and what that just means is, how much pixels are you cramming into a certain amount of space. So how much detail you're going into. And in this subject, this number right here can change as big as it wants almost. And so if we have a limited concept of, because there's only a set amount of neurons, for example, there's only a set amount of connections in the brain. But we have to remember that the current state of your brain is dependent on we find that it's dependent on that. But we also find that if we're thinking in terms of just the brain, that this concept right here is related still in the concept that we had in macro, where it's based off of a sort of string of events. Or a string of sums. And that's because as we develop and go throughout our lives, all of these life experiences that we have change the structure of our brain, to change our reactions. For example, things that create PTSD, trauma, happy moments. Just general sad moments, moments of loss. And so all of these contribute to the current social sum of your brain. And so just like we can say in macro, all of this is dependent on how your brain is structured at this moment. And of course, because we are talking about because we're talking about macro organization, what I mean by these sums is you have a string of events of more sums. And so that's what I mean by this shorthand here. And this concept is exactly the same, except I'm using notation instead of, how I was explaining a story. It's like stories. So what we're finding is the more detail that we give, the more we can keep going down. Like, for example, say we have this neuron, that neuron, and they're having direct influence on each other. There's a response and an initiation between them. But these communicate by firing neurotransmitters or electrical impulses. And so what's a common one, let's just focus on, would be serotonin, right? And so what exactly is serotonin? Well, it's the chemical structure is this. And so all of these connections influence each other, right? It's the exact same concept that we're having here. There is, in fact, a sum right here as well. And the sum right here is directly related to that. But to go into the concept of organization in terms of resolution, let's focus on just NH2. Now that's nitrogen and hydrogen, two hydrogens. Now all of these are going to have influence on each other. And it's a distinct influence, because if we just said we had H2O, they're going to have the same concept we've been talking about, but it's distinct from this because there's different elements at play. And then let's continue this further. Let's just say we're just focusing on the, let's just say we're just focusing, to make this simple, on hydrogen. Now, hydrogen has one proton, one neutron. Oops, that's way too big. And essentially, there is a cloud of probability. So it could be here, it could be here, it could be here, it could be here, you know. But hydrogen only has one electron. And so you would say that all of this has a direct influence on each other, right? Because it's the building block at that moment. And then let's just say we're talking about just the neutron. Well, what's the neutron made out of? Well, it's made of these things called quarks. But then you have to go, okay, if there's multiple quarks, for example. But then, what are quarks made out of? And that's the fundamental concept that we don't know. That's the end of the chain there. But we can see that we find the concept of macro collective organization all in here, just in that category, right? The same goes for here, here, here. Yeah. And all this lead to the quark, right? Or if we're thinking in terms of okay, there we go. Or again, if we're thinking in perspective to the quark, in perspective of this you get the point. Just as in perspective to respect to this, we have dependence on so what we're finding is we can kind of keep going. And even just the sense of your brain. We could also talk about resolution in terms of a home. Let's say there's stuff here, stuff there, stuff there, stuff there, something going on outside. And you have grass. Driveway, walkway. So what is the current state, or we could say the sum of this house, right? Well, it's the current state of, say this is a desk, let's say this is a plant, this is a tree, not tree, bookshelf, and this is the door, or whatever, and then we have the grass, and then we have anyone that comes into interaction with it, the driveway, walkway. We have, that's a painting or something. And so all of these objects have direct connection to each other, right? And that's because all of this, defines the sum of the house. Just like we have the social sum. So as soon as let's say, I forgot what I think I said it's a bookshelf. Let's say we move the bookshelf here. Well, all of a sudden, all these connections that make up the foundation or the current theory of your house changes. It actually changes everything. Because think about it, we're having to draw all new connections. Everything is related to each other. If it wasn't, then the house wouldn't look differently at all, if that makes sense. And we can have the same concept that we have over here, but we have it with the desk. So let's just go, for example, with the desk. There we go. And my screen is only going to be responsive. Okay. So let's just say we have the desk. Now it's made out of all these add-ons. It has certain characteristics. It's a certain color. But as soon as you change one thing about the desk, you change the desk's current sum, meaning you have a new desk, which has connections to you, for example, or the whole entire house. Because if you change a certain aspect about the house, the whole house changes. The whole current theory or reflection of the house changes. Again, that's because everything is connected to each other. The house has a completely different look if you move something. Just as the current theory, and by theory I mean the current state of your place, is dependent on how things are organized. And so, which brings a weird question, is the house always the same? And no. Because think of yourself, you have to do dishes, to clean, you have to pay bills or something. You have to vacuum, you have to move things around. But with all of this, if the current theory of your house wasn't changing like I'm talking about, then you would never have to do dishes. Clean, you'd never have to do dishes, you'd never have to clean. Aspects like that. If we change a few elements of the desk, again, we have a current different state of the desk, which depends highly and deeply connected to the concept of its connections to the house as a whole. So we can go as far as we want to. We can think of this as a whole desk, or we can think of it as a group of molecules. You can think of that group of molecules as a group of matter. Each of those matters has connections to that, and so that's what we're finding. And so we also have to ask ourselves, is the current, so the house obviously is never the same. And we can also argue this is like if we have bacteria, something dirty on it. That bacteria either grows or dies. But like when the bacteria dies, for example, the current sum of the house is equal to something different because the desk is different. Okay, so now I'm gonna have to take a break because my headset is about to die. But we'll get back to here, and I will clip these two videos together to make sure everything looks fine. But sorry for the interruption. Okay, sorry for the interruption. So let's go back to what we were talking about. So we have already established concepts of the current state of things, even in terms of inanimate objects, or give an example of what resolution is. And we can describe this in the concept of macro-organization as well. I also realized I kept saying macro. I meant macro in the previous video, but whatever. Okay, so let's just say we have you. It's bigger. Okay, let's just say we have you, and we have a friend, normal connections, and then let's focus on one person. Now this person's going to have, obviously, branches of sums. In fact, you could say that there is infinite many of them. But let's just say we focus on one person. They have all of these sums. That's one person. And then the concept of more sums. And the concept of a person again. Just looking. That person has many different sums. And you get the point. And these can be people, these can be your brain, for example, these can be inanimate objects. So already we have this concept of like, if we keep zooming in, we could zoom in as much as we want to. In fact, we could zoom in as many combinations as it is allowed with how many people there are in the world. And in a lot of ways, it's the same concept of social networking. And the biggest question comes to is how far does this influence happen? Because, yeah, we can say that this right here, let's just say that this right here is connected, right, to these elements and all those, all these elements and all those, all of this, this person and this person. But like how indirect or direct is this person right here? Do they have a very, very direct connection to them? Or is it just really distant? So in other words, if you remove this factor, let's just say the longest thing we can have, could you say this same, he's in, or this person's in the same state? And no, but there's varying degrees of influence in these things. For example, if I were to draw a graph, and this brings a question is like, how far can you go away from the line of influence? So if we have a 0 right here, to make that bigger, you can't see it. Let's make it black. So if this is 0, right? This is 1. So anyway, what we can find is that there's an asymptote, or a line that progressively gets closer to 0. But never quite reaches it. There's always this buffer. But it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And it's the same concept for the speed of light. You can never hit truly the speed of light or go beyond it without experiencing changes in mass. And so like really direct influences, you could argue could potentially stop here. Or you could say stop here. But there is still this connectivity. And it just depends that if someone is right here, how big of an impact do they have to someone that's this far away from them? And so that's a question that brings a lot of question. And so with this concept of, and in relevance to what's going on right now, is mass, no, I guess let's just talk about logic. You know what, actually, I'm going to change my mind. We're going to talk about the lonely child. Now, the lonely child thought experiment is, let's just say you have a child in a house or in some building, and you want to see what happens, or imagine what happens if we take this child and remove all social influences from that, from the very beginning of life. Now that's kind of hard to do, because you need to feed the baby, you need to change its diaper, you need to do a lot of things that facilitate not dying. But if you had machines, let's just say, feed the kid when it's hungry, if you had limited items in the room, or just a completely fine room, but the baby has never seen and experienced people, even though throughout its entire life, just because it's in this element. And so it brings a few questions. It brings, would you receive the same response in this situation as you do with social isolation, um, when like in jail or something like that, and how people can lose their minds if they're in solitary confinement for too long, um, which is a good example as to how the environment can have direct influences on your life. Um, but there's also the aspect of who even gave birth to this kid. And if that kid was immediately taken away and putting into the lonely child experiment, um, or maybe way into the future we can clone. But no matter what, there has to be the transfer of this. Because let's just say you made the clone outside, you still have to bring it over. Um, you could do the cloning process, for example, in here, but that still involves people. Um, as in handling the process and leaving the child there. So what we're finding is it's impossible to completely remove the concept of human interaction. And this can be through a variety of things, such as who, who made the house? Well, a human did. Or let's just say you have a future and it's a robot who made the house. Well, still the human, because the human had to make the robot, right? And even if you have automated aspects to take care of the baby until it is of age that it can start taking care of itself, will it figure out how to take care of itself? Will the child go mad with a life of zero social interaction from all that they can remember? Um, but you would say that all this right here is direct. And you could say all this right here is indirect. Um, but see, where it gets weird like that, as in, if it weren't for this person, let's just say if it weren't for, so let's just say you have something made to feed, as made by a human. Well, the human still has direct relationship between this human or the person that makes the clone. I had it mixed up at the beginning. Um, or even the person giving birth to child. Those are actually all direct. And I misstated that. But I mean, when you start going into the resolution of who this person is, the relation to the child starts getting further and further apart and closer to zero, but never quite makes it. Like parent, parent. Now you could argue that, you could say that that is direct influence, because if it weren't for, say, this person right here, then you wouldn't be alive. But if you look at other sums, and their sums, how far can you go along? And so the lonely child experiment is about simply how would the kid interact with this environment? What actions would they do? How would they go about life? Would they just completely die from emotional effects or how our brain is constructed? Um, there's a lot to talk about, and we have already gone through a lot. And so we've covered resolution, and we have covered the lonely child, and we've kind of touched on the concept of direct influence. Now, here comes the interesting bit, and that's the effects of on logic. Um, so could you argue um, that what was I going to say? Um, is 5 plus 5 equal 10 logical? Yes, it is. And I would say it's because it's following this system. Um, well, our emotions logical? Yes, they are, because they're a process that follows this example. You have to have something uh, to have something. You need the something to create it. And that you can never not have something. Or there's nothing to make. Like, think about it. If I don't have the parts for a computer here, I can't build the computer. The Big Bang is a concept of dense matter expanding, exploding, and going, stuff like that. But that still came from something. Um, and so we kind of ask ourselves now is, what is time? Now, some people argue that time is a concept invented by humans and that doesn't exist. And so, with all that we've covered, are you going to say that time exists? And the answer, I feel like, touches on no. Because if time is an infinite line, you don't just have a starting point and then it goes on, because you have to have the something here. So if this is proving that you have to have something to create something, then that means that there was never a beginning of time because something had to come before it. And it doesn't logically make sense to say that time abruptly starts. Something abruptly starts. There's always a process. And I believe a lot of it is just that we don't know enough to do it. Even the concept of, you know, electrons, stuff like that, and they pop all over. They could be here, they could be here, they could be here, they could be here, here, they could be here, here, here. You never know. But they're still existing, and there's still a process of why that moves there, or why that may move there. Even though they're quote unquote popping in and out, like in and out of existence, there's still always electrons, and the same number of them. Or else it would stop being exactly what it is, you know. So like maybe if you have the movement of, let's just in this case use the opposite, that this is the electron. In one place currently, and this is the electron post. There has to be something behind that, because if it weren't for that something, the process would never happen. And then the fundamentals of to why that happens has something too. And so this connects to like the brain element example and also resolution. Because electrons are energy. Electrons are involved in the making of molecules. Molecules are the neurotransmitters in that example. The neurotransmitters are responsible for your thoughts and the communications between those neurons. And then collectively, from those pathways being made by the brain because of your life events, equals to the current structure of your brain, with the post organization creating a different pre-organization, like we were talking about, because there is future influence. And if we have two people, this friend here, let's say, because remember we were talking about the breakup thing. Actually, let's remove that person. Let's just keep that person there and say it's a different situation. Now, all of these are connected, right? And the same goes for all of this. But can you say you have to add this person to that person? Well, no, because this right here is the current. Sure, that's the past, or the pre-sum, or the post. But remember, it can be flipped around too. Because we're thinking in perspective, and in perspective is a really important concept that we need to really know, because this is in perspective of this person. If we're thinking of perspective of that person, then it flips. Because this person's future doesn't necessarily, or this person's future doesn't necessarily connect to this person. And so it brings this element of, if there is a degree of separation because of the aspect of time, at the same time it can be flipped, that also brings a question as to, philosophically, what is time? What functions it play? Is it just a human-made concept? Are we just trying to find reason and say, okay, it's convenient for our lives to say we have 24 hours in a day, and that right now it's 4:02, and and 4:03 would be the future. If we didn't have that, we wouldn't have a lot of modern things in society. But it definitely brings some question. And so I'm hoping you've been able to kind of think about the lonely child experiment for a bit since we've gone into it. And I would say that the answer is a child would not survive, because there would be nothing to learn from. There would be no foundation of this fundamental concept that is humans and social nature. It would not exist, just at all. So these brings up other logical questions as well. It's like, can we predict the future? Yeah, I would argue that we can, if we have enough information. If we include the pre-sum, the current, and the post-sum, if you know everything when it comes to direct influence on the pre-sum, then you can figure out the direct response, the first step. And by first step is, like, let's just say I say something angry, right? I can predict the future in terms of the response. Now you might be saying, okay, well, what if, if you're building that off previous experiences, what if, the person stops reacting that way and starts being calm? Well, you can still predict that, because you can still see change, and if you knew that that was something the other person was working on, then you'd be able to start going, okay, then I can see the result of the post-sum, or as we can say, the change of organization from result. All right, sorry, got interrupted again. Um, so let's continue with all of this and continue what we were talking about. Um, so we can sort of predict the future from this change of organization if we know enough. Um, and so there's there's weird aspects too that come into play when it comes to logic. And that's questions like, was there ever a beginning? Um, and that question also is kind of what we were talking about when it comes to time. Uh, because if there is ever a beginning, is there really time? Um, and I've been defining the world as um, something doesn't come from nothing. Something always have to come from something. Because if you have nothing, you can't create something. Or there's the law that matter is neither created nor destroyed, which is the same concept. And a lot of people might say, like, when it comes to something from nothing, it's like, you have your space, the final frontier, and then you have these particles popping in and out. Space isn't exactly as empty as people like to think it is. Um, and these are popping in and out of existence. Um, Now, one could say, I've been told when it comes to these concepts that of this example, saying like, well, something is obviously being created from nothing here. And is not necessarily the concept. It's like the atom thing. You just don't know where it will be. No, the electron thing. You just don't know where it will be. So, what if this exact one pops in and out of existence? It pops over there, or this one pops over here. This one pops over here. And that's what this construct kind of makes us have to conclude almost. Because we're finding when it comes to the social sum that there is always something that creates something. Um, so that's that. Um, Another aspect that comes into question, which is also weird, is what have we been unknowingly responsible for? You personally. Now, a lot of people might say, trashing the environment, all that stuff. And humans do definitely are definitely responsible. But it's mostly just corporations. um, but anyway, so what are we unknowingly responsible for? And that brings questions is like, have our action killed anybody? For example, if you are walking around, drop a rock, maybe later on someone walks by, they trip, they fall over. Or maybe you're driving, you drive aggressively and the person behind you gets emotionally impacted, and then they turn down the next street, they crash into something later on because of their emotional impact. Or to be less morbid, what love have you created? Specifically in someone's life that you didn't know you did. Because all of this follows macro organization. Because again, here, let's see if I can find what I'm talking about here. If we're talking about this resolution concept, there we go. We're talking about this resolution concept here. Maybe your effect, this, yeah, maybe this effect on them, has an effect on them, makes them die or fall in love, like our previous video. And so humans have a very distinct ability to manipulate their environment in a vast network that's a lot like the internet. It's just the internet is a pretty good example of this process becoming more rapid because we have more direct communication with everybody around us. Like when we go on the computer, we can talk to whoever we want to that's on the internet, that's all over the world, or ham radio, or anything like that. All this has been extended and made stronger by the concept of some form of communication we have. And so I'm going to end the video there. And I'm going to leave you with a question. Is mass hysteria stupid? Is the concept of people buying a shit ton of toilet paper, is that stupid? Is that logical? Or is it logical? Can you think of anything else when it comes to logic that connects to this construct? Because remember, it applies to inanimate objects too, especially since when you involve social or life in general. When you involve life in general, you have a lot of elements, and you also have potential elements of influence that you could not be aware of. So I'm going to end the video here, and I would like to thank you for watching.